So if you follow my second channel or have interacted with me on Discord or has seen this little icon here at the bottom right corner of the screen, you might have noticed that I have an interest in a certain blue-haired deadpan Esper. I was first exposed to Hinamatsuri back in 2018 when the anime was first released during the spring season. It's only been recently that I decided to read the manga, and I have to say, there's a lot to unpack, specifically pertaining to the differences between the manga and its anime adaptation and how it seems to skip and move around a ton of different content. Now, this isn't uncommon for anime adaptations, especially ones that have a set of episodes per season, which in this case it's 12. It's normal to be selective about what chapters to adapt and even make a few minor adjustments in the script, which I guess is also what happened here in Hinamatsuri, but the differences between both materials were enough to kind of compel me to make a video highlighting the changes. So the first episode starts off with a flash forward to a scene that takes place much later on in the story where Mao is fighting against some members of the Supernatural Fitness. Not only is this scene not present in the first chapter of the manga, but this is actually something that only happens at the start of a 3-year time skip during chapter 47. The manga starts off roughly the same way as the episode does after the flash forward scene, which takes place during the present time, and Nita meets Hina pretty much the exact same way. Where things start to differ is after they went to the supermarket to buy clothes and accessories, because in the anime, they went home and Hina saw a news story that inspired her to go to school and asked Nita to sign her up to it. In the manga, this only happened after Hina had assaulted a rival family and she asked to attend school as a reward for that deed. While in the anime, this was settled after she had threatened him, which is ironic because physically intimidating Nita is a tactic she used several times in the manga, and it's nowhere near as frequent in the anime. There's even a scene where Nita was at work with his Oyabun and his second in command where they were talking about the Shinozuka clan, and while in the anime Nita was worried about what she was doing in school, in the manga he was worried about her presence as a whole. One of the things Nita demanded Hina to do under the condition that she would attend school was for her to restrain her powers and keep it a secret. While she did accept this deal, something that she never clarified was that her not using her powers for long periods of time would cause her to discharge a lot of energy in the form of an explosion. In the anime, this happened when she was at home, which caused the apartment to blow up. Afterwards, Nita came with a solution, which was use her powers to cut and collect trees as a way to relieve her urge to use the powers. In the manga, on the other hand, Hina exploded while she and Nita were visiting his Oyabun, who was hospitalized after a surprise attack by the Shinozuka clan. The true nature of the explosion was covered up by Nita, and the Ashikawa Gumi syndicate were led to believe that this was an attack from the Shinozuka clan, which ended up elevating the tension between these two Yakuza groups to the point where members of the Shinozuka clan were captured and tortured as a punishment for the explosion that they didn't even cause. The solution of using her powers to cut trees is also in the manga. The only difference is the sequence of events, because it all occurred after all of this had happened, while in the anime, this solution came before the Oyabun was even initially attacked. In episode 2, Anzu is first introduced into the series. In the original material, we got 3 additional chapters before her debut. 2 of them were never really adapted in anime form, while the other one was, but it came out as a second segment in episode 2. After Hina and Anzu had the rock paper scissors match, Anzu commented that Hina had changed since the last time she saw her after she had asked her to spend some time before they would eventually leave. This always confused me because from my perspective, Hina just arrived on Earth, but when you read those chapters before Anzu's debut, it actually does offer some context as to how she could have grown. In chapter 3, when an armed man infiltrated her school and was threatening her class, Hina was forced to take the initiative and think for herself instead of being ordered to eliminate a threat like how she used to be when she was exploited by her home people. In chapter 4, Hina became upset when Nita decided to reclaim his stature as a womanizer by reducing his time with her, and Utaku taught her a lesson about expressing herself in order to convey her feelings. In chapter 5, she accidentally created a hole in the boat, which would cause it to sink, and witnessing Nita stressing over how he would fix the situation made her experience guilt and a sense of duty to repair her mistake as much as she could. This, plus the unquantifiable time she spent living on Earth, would explain why Anzu got the impression that Hina had changed since the last time she saw her. Now, in regards to the events related to Anzu living among homeless men and Hina getting disowned, all play out mostly the same with some minor set design changes, like Nita and Hina reuniting in a parking space instead of the building hallway. They also squeezed in a chapter that came out later when Hitomi crossed with her teacher, while she was working at a bar. But where things start to become really out of order is with the following chapter after the disownment arc, because in the manga, the chapter following it is where Hina runs for student council president, but in the anime, this happened 3 episodes later. Instead, the way they decided to continue from here was through prioritizing the chapters that were about Anzu's lifestyle as a homeless girl. So they jumped to chapter 13 where Anzu first met Hitomi, followed by chapter 14 adapted in episode 5 where both of them and Hina were recycling old TVs. Then in the same episode for the following segment, they adapted a story that comes out 6 chapters later, which was when some of Hitomi's colleagues were suspecting that she was having an inappropriate relationship with the teacher. As for episode 6, we have to rewind a few chapters, namely 12, where Nita introduces Hina to his mother and sister for the first time. Everything mostly plays out the same. Then of course the chapter following this has already been adapted episodes prior to this. So for the second segment, they ended up jumping quite a few chapters. Something I noticed while reading the manga is that the anime made sure to include as much of Anzu's character arc to the point where the amount of screen time she receives is proportionally larger than the percentage of panel time she receives in the manga. As we jump to chapter 22 where her homeless community had to move away from the park where they lived and transfer to a new territory, and she ended up being adopted by a family that owns a restaurant. They made sure to adapt the entire transition even until the first segment of episode 7, so up until this point things were moving in order. That is, of course, until we get to the election story, which was adapted 12 chapters prior to this. Yeah, in case you couldn't tell, they do shuffle chapters a lot, which to be fair is not that uncommon with slice of life adaptations. But I can say that from this point, the anime does portray the events of the original material a lot more accurately than at the beginning. Although things are gonna get a little bit weird later on and you'll see why. So the next segment of this episode adapts chapter 25. This is a story where Hina injured her leg while Nita was swinging her around in excitement for the idea that he might bring home a mother for her to grow up with. That didn't happen though. 2 chapters are skipped after this and we get introduced to Kei in episode 8. The chief of security of whatever Esper organization that they're a part of, and in the anime this chapter is adapted in the following episode. The segment after this is where Mami found out that Hina had Esper powers, which aligns pretty well with the chapter's order of release. Now so far, the unadapted chapters and release order hasn't imposed any real confusion in the anime story, but this is the time where things start getting a little bit odd. So in the next segment, chapter 48 gets adapted, where Kei orders Hina to depart from the city and return to her original world. Now at the end of the story, because the teleporter that Hina used to travel there was thrown away, she could no longer return and had to stay in this world for the time being. When she returned home, she found out that Nita was celebrating her departure, and this ended up leading to a few chapters where things were pretty tense and awkward between them. However, in the anime, not only were none of those chapters ever adapted, but what came after were segments adapting earlier stories. In episode 9, while we did start off with Mao getting stranded in the island, which is actually in order, but after that we get an adaptation of chapter 36, and what makes this interesting is that this segment starts off by introducing a character called Tatsuhiko, who's actually someone that debuted chapters prior, like chapter 24 I'm pretty sure. Now, Tatsuhiko's main arc mainly revolves around the fact that he wants to see his son, whom he hasn't seen in a while, but in the anime, this arc of his is completely skipped. All of the chapters where his son eventually debuts, develops a relationship with Hina, and at one point isn't recognized by his own dad after they had met for the first time, none of that exists, which is kinda wild given how, based on the direction that the anime took right until the end, it's very possible that if a sequel series were to ever be in development, it would probably take place after the time skip, and it would be very interesting to know how much of his arc would be included in the anime when there's a lot of context that's missing here. But I digress. This segment plays pretty much exactly the same way as chapter 36, nothing worth noting besides the opening scene. I guess the following segment is fairly accurate in terms of which chapter it precedes since it's 37, but there is one additional line right around the end where Nita comes back home with a muskmelon. He comments on how he hopes to eventually apologize to Hina for celebrating her departure. This line doesn't exist in the manga since this chapter wasn't even released that far ahead in the story. Now, I could cover episodes 10, 11, and 12, but there's really not a lot to comment on. The very last episode covers the last few chapters before the time skip pretty accurately, and we were only inches away from seeing a very interesting turn of events. I'm currently still reading it, and there have been a few shifts in the settings. in general, things feel pretty fresh, and there's one thing I ultimately want to encourage all of you, especially if you've already watched Hinamatsuri, is that you should probably just read the manga. There's definitely a lot of skipped content, and some of my favorite chapters never even got the chance of getting adapted, so it is definitely worth it, in my opinion at least. In the meantime, I have to edit this video. More videos are coming in the future, and I hope you have a good day.